The big red button. So anyway, I envisioned this more as a group discussion than a lecture, which is why it's actually listed as such. But I did come up with a short sort of presentation to sort of seed the ideas for the discussion. And the first example was I was at work and I'm trying to debug something, and it's I lose the stack trace because it goes into a publisher subscriber design pattern, which is helped by Microsoft. They provide all sorts of things that you can do in the language, but it basically goes into this black box and disappears and reappears somewhere else. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, you got the one publisher, it's only got one subscriber, the subscriber is fixed. Why are we adding in this other goo in between? And, you know, I'd gotten a notice from nerds, and they said, you know, hey, have you got something to talk about? And I'm like, you know, there's a talk in here somewhere. I don't have enough really for a talk, but it's enough to start a discussion and find out if other people have seen other things like this, where I love publisher subscriber. It's a great pattern. I've seen it used in other applications really well. Microservices are basically, the entire concept is based on having publishers and subscribers, but it can be misapplied. And so that's where I got the idea of good ideas gone wrong. Another example I've seen is people who use singletons, which is another great pattern, but they overuse it, and basically it's an excuse to have globals. So there's another example. And then I was thinking about other possibilities. Things like 100% test coverage. You know, somebody may be fixated on 100% test coverage, but you're like, do you really need, are you really getting value out of that last 5-10% of test coverage? Do you need to have test coverage of get and set methods, for example? Probably not. You probably, even within testing, you probably have a better result if you spent more time testing more complex parts of the code more versus just going some rote testing. Comments for comments sake. This is another thing. At the company I work at, they've got the software, when you do a build, it will reject your code if you haven't commented every single parameter. And so you get a lot of comments that are like just a slightly longer, wordy version of what the parameter name is. Did that provide any value? I don't think so. Zero defects is the same with testing. I mean, there are some bugs that I like to say are the hop on one foot, swing a rubber chicken counterclockwise 5 times, and then the problem happens. Would the customer get better value if you spent time working on something they were going to use versus something that hardly ever shows up? Now, you know, to back up a little bit, if doing that causes the application to crash, then perhaps you do need to do it. But I mean, if it's just some minor thing, some dirt on the screen, maybe you'd be better off doing something else. I've seen this at other companies too, where they get a consultant, they come in and they're going to design this software, and they design it, they've got this 7-layer application design, and you've got this tiny little application. But they've got this pattern and they're going to apply it, and that pattern is probably great if you're building something for a Fortune 500 company and, you know, it's going to be large and complex and everything else. I've also seen this too. I don't know if anybody's familiar. I think Microsoft's dropped it at this point in time. They had a product called Workflow, which was designed for large companies, where it was basically to handle things like if you have an expense report, and you got to go and submit your expense report, and it's got to go to a certain manager. But if it's for more than a certain amount of money, it's got to go to the manager, and then the manager's manager has to approve it. And this thing could take, a month, because somebody could be on vacation themselves or whatever, but it handles all of that. But I've seen this applied in a place where just a simple state machine would do. And once again, you're adding a magic black box. What are you really getting out of it? I've seen this, only I think academics actually go and really claim this. I've been to things like this where we've had people go and say, methods should be no more than 10 lines, and you should have no more than 10 methods per class. And I look at that and I'm like, that's going to mean a lot more methods and a lot more classes, and that in and of itself adds complexity to the code. So, I understand you don't want, I've also seen, 500 line methods, which are obviously very bad, but there's, once again, small is good, but you can carry it too far. So like I said, I had that one thing at the beginning that I ran across, and I was like, this sort of seems like something where there's something there, I think. But I wanted to have a group discussion because I didn't have enough for a full 45-minute talk. And so this is where I ask people, what are your experiences? Let's open this up to a bitch session about things that you've seen where a good idea has gone wrong. And, I have some ideas as to sort of general rules of thumb to try to avoid stuff like this. And we can talk about that towards the end. But I'm hoping that all of you have some war stories here. Anybody want to volunteer to talk? This is going to be a very short session.
I don't know, based on what you've presented talked about so far, I'm just going to inject one very, very old, at this point, 1990s terminology that looks like it applies in a lot of this.
Yep.
Which is, I see a lot of YAGD.
What?
You ain't gonna need it. Left over from the old XP world,
Yes.
programming world.
Yes.
A lot of this is in putting a layer of abstraction in place in the thought that you might need this in the future. That's what a lot of this looks like to me.
Yeah, there is a bit of that. There is a bit of that. The 7-layer cake is addressing a need that doesn't exist. Some of this actually reminds me, a long time ago, I took some MBA courses, and one of them was on organizational structures. And one of the things they talked about is they said that the optimal organizational structure for a company that has 10 people is the boss is in charge of everything and knows everything and organizes everything and tells everybody what they're going to do. That's a great organizational structure when you have 10 people, but that's not the organizational structure you want when you have 50 people. It's not the organizational structure you have when you have 500 people, and it's not the organizational structure that you need when you have, tens of thousands of people. And so I think there's a lot of that going on in the examples that I mentioned as well, where, you're taking something that is designed and appropriate in one sense and applying it in another sense, blindly. Any other, and push back on me too, if you think that, we should have 100% test coverage, then tell me that I'm wrong.
I think the EAGD is another thing I would add to this list.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are times when you are going to need it. Right. I worked on a project last winter where we built a database table called email matches. And now we use it for emails and CSV and texting. Right. Which was, at least the CSVs was foreseeable.
Mm-hmm.
There are many more examples from that project, but that's the one I saw the other day.
The gang of four introduced the notion of programming patterns. One of the sections in their format is applicability.
Mm.
And I think we tend to forget that section, is that there's a time when this doesn't apply because, if you're going to talk from method 1 to method 2, then, dispatch doesn't apply. If you are going to have to dynamically determine who the recipient is, direct invocation is not going to apply.
Yes. Yeah, and I do think that there's a lot of that sort of stuff where, especially younger people, but this happens to more experienced people as well. They hear that X, Y, and Z is great. It's the thing that you should do, and they go off and do it without actually understanding why that particular thing is good, and as you say, not applying it in a particular way.
So I'm not really technical. I'm a program manager, so a lot of what you guys are talking about, I have no idea. But a couple of these I see a lot with clients where they think that it's an industry standard, and so they're going to push for it even though they don't understand why they're asking for it or even if it necessarily applies to them. So like this 100% test coverage literally just started a project where they contractually require this, and we couldn't get them to back off of it at all in the contracting process. And it brings up for me a conversation that we have quite frequently, which is the thing that you're selecting right sized for the problem that you have, right? And a lot of people forget to ask that question. Like, do I actually need the Fortune 500 company level application? Or could I have survived with a custom Google Sheets or Excel integration and just be done with it? But people have a hard time asking themselves that question. I wonder if it's just like, I want the flashy thing. I want the thing, whatever the thing is that Google has. Give me whatever it is that Google has, and that's what I want. Regardless of the fact that, to your point, the value's not there in that system.
Yeah. And, being an engineer, I take the negative form on management view that, the 7-tiered cake, the joke was, some executive read about it while he was in a plane in a magazine and decided that that's what they were going to do. And by golly, that's what we ended up being told to do.
And you've only got 3 people, so how are they going to eat a 17-layer cake?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my previous project, working with React, we were all kind of new to React and kind of figuring it out. React has hooks that can trigger, different things, and especially we were using a store, so we were sending things off to the store to be, modified and saved. And turns out when you overuse those hooks and they end up in every part of your code and they're all modifying the same thing, trying to find what was causing something was absolutely bananas. I was so frustrated with the whole thing. It was a mess. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, these are, like you said, in an appropriate place, that would be great, but in your particular case, it became a nightmare.
Yeah.
Maybe another example that I can think of that I've seen is we took over a Drupal site from a different vendor, and when that vendor had taken over the site or built it, whatever, they had downloaded their entire toolbox into the site. So all of these modules, regardless of whether or not they were using them, and that basically created a huge mess where now when you're just trying to update anything, you have to go back and say, is there some kind of vine of something else that has come in here that's not being used, and you never took it out, you never uninstalled it. But I do think that if you're a business, right, and you're just taking over the maintenance of Drupal sites, you might think, well, if I just upload my entire toolkit, then whenever I run into this problem, I'll just be able to use it, rather than thinking about, is that a thing that this site would have needed in the first place? And it's extremely bloated, the one that I'm thinking of right now.
And it's easy to get to a point of being bloated every time you're just like, oh, I just need another package for this, and grabbing things. And if you're not aware of A, what other people are already installed and using, and B, the size of things, it's really easy for it to get out of control.
It's shocking. They're the only one that we've seen come in like that, but I can imagine that from their business perspective, it seemed like a good idea. Like this is the tool set that my people are already familiar with. These are the ones that we want them to default to. So we'll just put them there.
I'm not sure if this really applies. I was working with a team on this one project, and we wanted to enforce an auto formatter for everything. So we had it like set up in the CI in Git hooks, and what happened was everyone had a slightly different version of it installed. So every time, every other commit, it would just like switch back and forth between, and like it took like 2 weeks to get that straightened.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's a whole other issue is how much value you're getting out of some of these rule-based checks. I mean, I remember the bad old days of using lint on, C++ code. And for the life of me, I never saw lint fix an actual problem. Complained about a lot of things, and I made a lot of changes because of it. But I cannot for the life of me recall it, took a look at it and said, oh, I forgot to check a pointer before I referenced it, kind of a thing. So yeah, those things also happen. So not that I came up with a slide for this, but just anything else? Seemed like we sort of petered out. Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a number of things. So maybe there isn't as large of a talk here as I thought there was, or discussion, or maybe we just needed more people to carry it on longer. But there's a lot of things that I think are, as you said, adding things that never get used. I had one of the other reasons why they decided they were going to use this Microsoft workflow product as opposed to just a simple state machine was because they were like, oh, we're going to let our customers create their own workflows. And, the Microsoft workflow has a GUI that allows you to graphically create your own workflows and everything. So they use this tool, and it's a nightmare, and it's holding us back from upgrading to newer software and everything. And do you want to know how many customers actually created their own workflows? 0. Which gets to your thing about, whatever. And I wasn't at the company at the time, so I don't know whether this was something that marketing came up with, or whether it was something that the consulting group that came in and designed all this software used to sell the idea of using workflows. So we have one, the which Agile tries to get away from, which is the whole don't design things for things that you might one day want. Another sort of similar is when I first started, and I started 40 years ago with C, they used to talk about the rule of 3, which said don't spend time, which I guess sort of works into that as well. Don't spend time designing I don't want to say quality user interface, but don't spend a lot of time coming up with an API. And unless the software that you're creating the API for is used 3 times in your application and used in 3 different applications. Because they were like, it's not worth the effort to come up with this, very well defined, very whatever, unless you're going to actually get some value out of it. Trying to think what other sort of, the understand why you have a certain rule before you go, or a certain pattern before you apply the pattern. Don't just apply it because everybody applies it and everybody knows that this pattern is a great pattern. Anybody else come up with any other sort of general ideas as to, just always think about what's the other cost. A lot of times people go and they do things and they don't think, well, what am I paying for this abstraction? So, once again, the publisher subscriber, great, love it. Like I said, services are based entirely on the existence of that pattern. But are you losing the ability to easily, do a stack trace and find out where things are getting called and understand the flow within your code? That's a cost.
And given that I have spent exactly 0 hours working for Netflix, I can tell you that the number of times I have needed microservices is exactly 0.
Well, the thing is, I worked for another company. They did software for the power grid out in California. And the guy had a completely delusional vision of what object-oriented programming was. That wasn't object-oriented programming, but he thought it was, and he had done it back in the 90s, so I'll give him a little slack on that. But the one thing that he did do well, and he didn't call it microservices because microservices didn't exist then, is that he took a very Unix approach of you've got a service, and the service does one thing, and it takes input, and it sends out output, and other people can go and register that they want that output. So publisher, subscriber. And it worked really, really well in his application. So, microservices, or whatever it is that he did, it is a good path. You'll get no complaint from me on that in general. But once again, microservices can be over applied too. You could have an application that's like got 20 million microservices, and all of a sudden now the complexity is which version of which microservices are compatible with the other microservices that exist within your system because you've broken everything down into these teeny tiny little parts. And now you've got 50 million of them.
It affords you scalability in individual components, but if you're only ever going to have 50 users logged in at the same time, say,
Yes.
which of those components are you going to scale?
Yes. No, you're exactly right. Once again, you have to understand why. What problem was it trying to solve before you apply? Because to your point, great. One of the other thing, you're right. The other great thing about microservices is that you can scale. I don't know whether you call this laterally or whatever, but basically you can scale so that each microservice is basically sitting on one computer, and therefore you can use a bunch of cheap computers to go and do your stuff. But to your point, if there's only 50 users, did that really buy you anything?
Abstraction does not require microservices.
Yes, well,
So, arguing that abstraction is inappropriate, I am not saying you should not define APIs between components, but that does not mean you should.
yes.
You can build a monolith that is.
It
Maybe
depends.
it's easier to build a monolith that
That's
is
easier.
not modularized.
Yeah, and there's fewer places for failure. If you're just calling stuff and it's all in memory, then you don't have to worry about possible communication errors.
But it's also easy to end up with a ball of spaghetti.
That is also true. All these things exist for a reason. I also go back to GoTo. That was a big thing when learning C is like GoTo, it's bad, it's horrible, you should never use GoTo. And that's not entirely true because GoTo actually works very well for error handling. On the other hand, I also went through a lot of code that was spaghetti code that had go-tos going everywhere, and it was, I understand why it has such a bad reputation.
But we just replaced them with exception handling. It was no more readable.
Yeah, the examples I've seen where go-to makes sense is where you have a lot of, ifs and thens and everything else in a method, and you want it to all go to one place. which I guess exceptions would work, but exceptions in and of themselves is a fairly heavy.
That's what I say, it's basically replace them with exceptions, which don't work any better. They're no more readable.
Yeah. So. Anything else?
This is kind of a tangent, but one of the conference takeaways that has stuck with me the longest is the notion that tech debt is only tech debt if you're paying interest on it,
You know, I was going to put that in there.
which is
It's-
like
yeah.
all of these are problems.
Yes.
You know, maybe your lender has never actually found real things,
Mm-hmm.
but is it costing you? What is it costing you? Same with tests. We run into this with tests a lot. Test suites that take 20 or 30 minutes to run are a huge pain. And flaky tests are a huge pain. Those are costing us.
Mm-hmm.
We have not 100% test coverage, but we had tests for stupid things that were not actually costing us.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't add to the runtime significantly.
I mean, I'm a big fan of unit tests, but there are issues. I mean, as you say, flaky or unit tests that are brittle, so that if something changes somewhere, all of a sudden the unit test fails, and now you're spending time fixing the unit test, which didn't actually find a problem, but because the code was brittle in one way or another, it broke the unit test.
Tests that break every February 29th.
Are we speaking from experience this year?
Yes. 29th, December 31st, today. Some time change.
Mhm. But yeah, technical debt is another thing where you can chase. Well, I mean that gets down to that bug thing where I was like,
Same sort of thing.
some things are obscure, and I mean, just as a side note, one of the places I worked at had what I thought was a really good way of evaluating bugs and whether or not they can be done, and they had basically a graph, 2 axes. One axis was severity of the outcome, so everything from it's a typo on the screen to crashes the system, and on the other axis was frequency, to basically get at how often is somebody going to see it. So I mean, a typo on the splash screen that everybody sees when they whatever gets a high priority, but another one doesn't, and then obviously something that crashes always gets attention.
And then there's also priority.
Yeah.
Or embarrassment.
Well,
You just
thing
spell
that,
your company name on the splash
Yeah.
screen.
that's
You're
kind of,
gonna fix that.
I'd actually add a third dimension to that, which is how long it takes to fix.
Yeah.
Because obviously fixing a typo generally takes you no time whatsoever and is worth fixing. But there are other bugs where you get 5 minutes into it and you're like, oh dear Lord. Or actually another aspect would be risk. How risky is it changing this code to fix this bug? Am I likely to cause another problem? And IBM at one point in time stopped fixing one of their mainframe operating systems because they came to the conclusion that for every bug they fixed, they generated a new bug. And they just decided that it's better to know which bugs we have than to constantly introduce new ones. So, anyway, that's all I've got. I'm sorry this wasn't as exciting as I had hoped it would be. I had hoped for a lot of war stories with other people telling me different things, but thank you for coming. And we'll see you next time.